Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Thomas hadn't planned to visit Amelia's office that day. It was a last-minute decision driven by a strange, nagging feeling he couldn't shake. He had finished work earlier than usual, so why not surprise her? He even imagined her excited smile, her delighted gasp. Instead, what greeted him was nothing short of a nightmare. The office was eerily quiet as he made his way down the hall. Her door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see inside. And there they were, Amelia, half-dressed, sprawled across the boss's mahogany desk, and Richard, her boss, leaned over her. Time seemed to freeze, and Thomas felt the floor beneath him disappear. His mind refused to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. Richard glanced up, catching Thomas's horrified expression. Instead of showing any guilt or shock, he smirked. The smirk alone was enough to trigger something primal in Thomas. Rage, white-hot and unstoppable, surged through him, clouding all reason. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Thomas's voice cracked with fury, shaking as it echoed through the room. Amelia gasped, scrambling to cover herself, but Richard? He just laughed. That laugh would be Richard's last mistake. Thomas's vision blurred as he stormed into the office, the sound of Richard's smug laughter ringing in his ears. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a taunt, a confirmation that this man felt no remorse for what he'd done. All the images rushed through Thomas's mind. Years of marriage, love, loyalty, and everything he had built with Amelia crashing down in an instant. Rage became his only reality. Get away from her. Thomas roared, charging at Richard with an intensity that surprised even him. Richard barely had time to step back, his smirk faltering as Thomas's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling across the desk. Amelia screamed. "Thomas, stop. Please." Her voice cracked, but it only fueled his fury. Thomas couldn't hear her through the roaring in his head. He had lost control. Richard groaned, trying to push himself off the floor, but Thomas was on him again, gripping him by the collar and slamming his head into the polished wood of the desk. "You think you can do this?" Thomas growled through gritted teeth, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "I think you can take what's mine." Each word punctuated by another punch, blood beginning to smear across Richard's face as he slumped, dazed. Amelia, still half-dressed, rushed forward, grabbing Thomas' arm. "Thomas, please, stop. He's not worth it. Just stop." Tears streamed down her face, her words barely breaking through the fog of anger. She tugged at his arm, desperately trying to pull him away from Richard, who was now unconscious, slumped like a rag doll on the floor. But Thomas couldn't stop, not yet. He needed Richard to feel the pain, the betrayal, the humiliation he had just experienced. But in that moment, seeing the bloodied mess beneath him, Thomas realized something. No amount of violence would fix this. No amount of broken bones would mend his shattered trust. He released Richard, letting his body drop limply to the floor, unconscious, and turned his attention to Amelia. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of Amelia's sobs. She clutched at her blouse, trying to cover herself, her tears falling like rain onto the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered, over and over again, the words barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear, Thomas, I didn't want this." Thomas stared at her, chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the fight. Her apology, weak and desperate, felt like salt in a fresh wound. "I didn't want this?" He spat, his voice thick with cold disbelief. "You didn't want this, but you let it happen? You let him touch you. You." Amelia shook her head frantically, her sobs intensifying. "No, it wasn't like that. I don't know what came over me. He kept pressuring me." And she reached out, trying to touch Thomas's arm, but he recoiled, stepping back as if her touch burned him. "Stop." His voice was dangerously calm now. "Stop making excuses. You made your choice, Amelia. Now you'll live with it." Ain't. Amelia collapsed to the floor, her sobs turning into guttural cries, but Thomas felt nothing but a cold emptiness inside. His anger had burned out, leaving only a hollow shell of the man he was before. But he looked down at her, watching her cry, and in that moment, he realized that whatever love he once had for her was gone. Without another word, Thomas turned on his heel, leaving Amelia and her pathetic pleas behind. He stepped over Richard's unconscious form, not sparing him another glance. The decision was made. As he walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway, the only thing left in his mind was the finality of it all. There was no going back. Unbring back. Thomas stepped into the cool air outside the office building, his heart still pounding, his hands still trembling with the remnants of the fury that had overtaken him inside. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the creeping weight of reality. He stopped just outside the building, leaning against the cold brick wall, struggling to catch his breath. His fists were still clenched, knuckles bloodied and swollen from the brutal confrontation with Richard. He stared down at them, the red staining his skin, a grim reminder of how far he had let things go. But what was worse, the violence or the betrayal? The image of Amelia, half naked and crying, flashed in his mind again, and with it, a fresh wave of disgust surged through him. His wife, the woman he'd spent years building a life with, had betrayed him. And for what? A smarmy, arrogant boss who thought he could have whatever he wanted. Thomas's stomach churned. He doubled over, the weight of the situation crashing into him all at once. He felt sick to his core, his body convulsing as he leaned over, dry heaving in the alley behind the office. How had his life spiraled into this nightmare? When he finally stood upright, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, the realization hit him like a freight train: there was no fixing this. Amelia had made her choice, and no matter how many times she cried or begged for forgiveness, things could never go back to the way they were. Their marriage was broken, shattered beyond repair. But the questions kept swirling in his mind. How long had this been going on? How many times had they met like this behind his back? Every moment of their life together felt like a lie now. The laughter, the shared dinners, the nights spent in each other's arms, were they all part of the illusion? As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, Thomas pulled out his phone. His first instinct was to call someone, his brother, maybe, or his best friend. But what would he say? "Hey man, guess what? Caught my wife screwing her boss today. What's new with you?" No. He couldn't bear the thought of sharing this humiliation with anyone yet. Instead, he opened his message app, staring at the blank screen for a long moment. Should he text Amelia? Should he demand answers? But then what was left to say? Her tearful apologies and explanations meant nothing now. She had made her choice. Thomas had seen everything he needed to see. With a deep breath, he typed a single sentence: "I'm leaving the house tonight. Don't be there when I get back." He hit send, the message delivered to her phone. For a moment, he wondered if she was still inside, reading it. Would she follow him, run out after him, try to explain? He hoped not. He didn't have the strength for another confrontation. As the message sent, Thomas felt an odd sense of relief wash over him. It was the first decision he'd made since walking into that office, and in this small way, he was reclaiming control of his life. There was nothing left to salvage. This wasn't just the end of his marriage, it was the end of everything he had believed in. With a heavy heart, Thomas walked toward his car. He didn't know where he was going yet, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The drive back home was a blur. Thomas barely registered the roads or the familiar landmarks as he weaved through the city. His mind was somewhere else, trapped between the image of Amelia on that desk and the cold, hard truth that had now settled deep in his bones. His marriage was over. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, the tension still coiling in his chest. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, the screen lighting up with Amelia's name. He stared at it for a moment, his stomach twisting. It buzzed again. He knew what it would be: more apologies, more begging, more excuses. He let it ring out, the silence in the car more comforting than her words could ever be. He didn't need to hear her voice. Not now, not ever. Pulling into the driveway of their house, Thomas turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The house stood before him, the same as it always had, but now it felt like a stranger's home. The place where they had built memories together, raised plans for a future that no longer existed, now seemed foreign. The sight of it filled him with dread. Slowly, he opened the car door and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he made his way up to the front door, keys clutched tightly in his hand. The thought of walking into that house made him sick to his stomach, but he had no choice. He needed to grab a few things, and then he'd be gone. The door creaked open, and Thomas stepped inside, greeted by the hollow stillness of an empty home. The silence was deafening. He stood in the foyer for a moment, just staring around. The house was dark, shadows stretching across the floor, broken only by the faint light filtering in from the setting sun outside. Everything looked the same, but it felt entirely different. The living room, where they used to sit together, talk about their days, now seemed like a cold, lifeless space. He couldn't even bring himself to step inside. Thomas walked straight to the bedroom, instead, knowing exactly what he needed. His suitcase, a few clothes, some essentials. He would pack quickly and leave without a backward glance. The bedroom door opened with a soft click, and he stepped inside. Their bed stood at the center of the room, perfectly made, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In Polydiko Wentist, he went to the closet, pulling out a small suitcase and tossing in a few clothes. Each item he grabbed felt like it belonged to another life, another man. This wasn't his home anymore. It wasn't his life. He packed with mechanical precision, each movement deliberate, controlled, as if keeping his hands busy would stop his mind from spiraling. The phone buzzed again on the dresser. Amelia. This time he couldn't resist. He picked it up, seeing the flood of messages. I'm sorry. Please, Thomas, talk to me. It was a mistake, I swear. I love you. Each message made him feel colder. He tossed the phone onto the bed without replying. There was no point. Her words couldn't fix this. Her pleas couldn't undo the damage. Dipping up the suitcase, Thomas took one last look around the room at the memories that no longer held any meaning. So his eyes landed on a framed photo of the two of them, smiling, arms wrapped around each other at some long-forgotten vacation. It felt like looking at strangers. So without a second thought, he grabbed the suitcase and walked out of the room. He didn't need anything else. The house, the memories, the marriage, they were all behind him now. And with that, he closed the door, leaving it all behind. Thomas didn't look back as he left the house. The front door clicked shut behind him, but it felt like the slamming of a chapter in his life. The suitcase in his hand was light, yet it felt as heavy as the burden now settling on his shoulders. His footsteps echoed in the stillness of the evening as he walked back to the car, the cool air biting against his skin. The moment he threw the suitcase into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat, reality began to sink in. His mind had been running on adrenaline, still fueled by the raw fury of the confrontation at Amelia's office. But now, sitting in the quiet car, a crushing wave of exhaustion washed over him. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental. The weight of betrayal, the collapse of his marriage, was too much to bear. Yet he felt hollow, like a shell of the man he'd been just a few hours ago. That for a few minutes, Thomas just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. So the sky had darkened, and the street was silent. No cars passed by, no neighbors out for evening walks. Just silence. What now? The question hung in his mind like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. Where was he supposed to go? What was he supposed to do? His life had revolved around Amelia for years. Every decision, every plan, every step forward had included her. Now he was free, but that freedom came with a devastating emptiness. He reached for his phone, instinctively opening his contacts. His thumb hovered over his brother's name. Mike. He could call Mike. He'd understand. They could talk. And maybe Mike would offer some advice or a place to crash for the night. But the thought of explaining everything, reliving the humiliation, felt unbearable. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, Thomas turned the engine on, the hum of the car a faint distraction from the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed to get away from this place, from the house, from the memories. All. As he pulled out of the driveway, his mind flashed back to Amelia's face, her tear-streaked cheeks, the way she had begged him to stop. He clenched his jaw, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and despair. How could she have done this to him? The woman he had trusted with his heart, his life, had shattered it all with a single, selfish act. And now she expected him to forgive her. So the city lights blurred as he drove through the streets, aimlessly. His grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles turning white again as he replayed the scene in his head. The sound of Richard's mocking laughter, Amelia's cries, the sickening thud of his fists hitting Richard's face, it all blended together into a chaotic mix of rage and pain. He pulled into a dimly lit parking lot, the kind of place where no one asked questions. It was a rundown motel, the neon sign flickering as if it, too, had given up. He didn't care about the condition of the place. He just needed somewhere to be alone, somewhere to think or maybe to forget. Inside the room, Thomas tossed his suitcase onto the floor and collapsed onto the bed. The mattress sagged beneath him, but it didn't matter. He stared at the ceiling, the cracks running across it mirroring the fractures in his own life. His phone buzzed again on the nightstand, the glow of Amelia's name lighting up the dark room. Thomas closed his eyes, fighting the urge to throw the phone across the room. She had no idea what she had done to him, no idea how deeply she had cut him. With a deep breath, he grabbed the phone and turned it off, plunging the room into silence. Tonight, there would be no answers, no resolutions, only the weight of everything he had lost. Thomas woke up the next morning with a stiff neck and a sense of disorientation. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The sagging mattress beneath him, the musty smell of the cheap motel room, it all came flooding back. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, the events of the previous day hitting him like a tidal wave. Amelia, Richard, the fight, the betrayal. His phone was still off, lying face down on the nightstand where he had left it the night before. He didn't want to turn it on. He didn't want to see more of Amelia's desperate texts or missed calls. The night had given him a small reprieve from the chaos, and he wasn't ready to let reality crash back in just yet. Thomas stood and walked over to the small bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered as he switched it on, casting an unflattering glow over the cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping it would shake the heavy feeling that clung to him like a second skin. But as he stared at his reflection in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. The man staring back at him was broken, a far cry from the confident husband who had walked into that office the day before. The memories of the fight came rushing back, and with them, a deep sense of shame. He had lost control completely. Sure, Richard had deserved it, hell, he probably deserved worse, but what did that make Thomas? He had always prided himself on being calm, rational. Yesterday, he had been anything but, and now Richard was out there somewhere bloodied and bruised, but still standing. And meanwhile, Thomas was here, hiding out in a dingy motel room, trying to piece together the ruins of his life. He sighed heavily and turned off the faucet, drying his face with a towel. What now? That he couldn't stay here forever. He needed to figure out what to do next. But the thought of facing the world, of confronting what his life had become, made him feel sick to his stomach. As he walked back into the main room, his gaze fell on his phone again. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, he'd have to deal with the fallout talk to Amelia, decide what came next, so he couldn't ignore it. But for now, he wasn't ready. He grabbed the phone and slipped it into his pocket without turning it on. Thomas decided to leave the motel. The air outside was crisp, the sun barely breaking through the early morning clouds. He had no destination in mind, just the need to move, to get away from the suffocating stillness of that room. His feet carried him through the quiet streets, each step bringing a flood of memories he didn't want to confront. He thought back to how it had all started with Amelia. The good times, the laughter, the small moments of joy that once made everything seem perfect. Their early years together were filled with the kind of love he thought would last a lifetime. How had they gotten to this point? How had they gone from inseparable partners to this? A familiar street corner caught his attention, and Thomas realized he had wandered into a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. The small cafe where he and Amelia used to go for coffee was just a few blocks away. He paused, staring down the road, the memories pulling at him like ghosts. It had been their favorite place back when they first started dating, long before the cracks in their marriage began to show. It had been their sanctuary, a place where everything seemed simple. Without thinking, he turned and started walking toward it, unsure of what he was hoping to find. Maybe he just needed to remember what things had once been like before everything had gone so horribly wrong. Thomas reached the cafe, its familiar awning looking worn and weathered after all these years. The once bright green fabric was now faded, the letters of the cafe's name barely visible. Time had not been kind to the place. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door, the same one he and Amelia had walked through so many times in the early days of their relationship. Back then, it had been their little retreat, a cozy spot where they could escape the world, just the two of them. Now it felt like a monument to something lost, a relic of a time when life felt whole, simple, and full of promise. With a deep breath, Thomas stepped inside. The warm smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries hit him instantly, bringing with it a flood of memories. The small bell over the door chimed as he entered, and for a second he half expected to see Amelia sitting at their usual table, waiting for him with that bright smile she used to have. But of course, she wasn't there. The reality of the present was far colder. The cafe was quiet, almost empty, with only a couple of patrons scattered at different tables. Thomas made his way to the corner booth, their booth. It was still there, tucked away, just like he remembered. He slid into the seat, his hand absently running over the worn leather of the bench. How many times had they sat here, laughing, planning their future? It seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, sitting there alone, those moments felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. A waitress appeared, a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile. She handed him a menu, but he didn't need it. That he ordered the same coffee he always had, out of habit more than anything. As she walked away, Thomas leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, people passed by, going about their lives, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He felt like an outsider, watching a world he no longer belonged to. His mind wandered back to Amelia, to the woman she had been when they first met. She had been so full of life, so sure of everything. That was what had drawn him to her, her confidence, her energy. He had loved her for it, but somewhere along the way, that energy had turned into something else. It had become restless, hungry for something more. And in Richard, she had found it. A part of him wanted to hate her, to despise her for what she had done. But sitting here, in the place where they had once been so happy, he couldn't summon the anger. All he felt was sadness. Sadness for what they had lost, for what they could never get back. The coffee arrived steaming hot. He took a sip, but it didn't taste the same. Nothing felt the same anymore. The world had shifted, leaving him adrift, unsure of where to go next. As he sat there staring out the window, Thomas realized that it wasn't just Amelia he was mourning. It was the man he used to be, the man who believed in love, in trust, in forever. That man felt like a stranger now, a shadow of someone he used to know, and as much as he wanted to believe he could find his way back to that person, deep down, he knew it was impossible. There was no going back, not to the way things were, not to who he used to be. The door to the cafe chimed again, and Thomas glanced up, half expecting another ghost from his past to walk in. But it was just a stranger, someone with their own story, their own life. Thomas finished his coffee in silence, knowing that whatever came next, he had to face it alone. Thomas left the cafe, the taste of bitter coffee still lingering on his tongue. The world outside felt colder now, more distant, as if he was seeing it through a veil. He wasn't sure why he had come here, perhaps hoping to find some clarity in a place that once meant something. But all it had done was remind him of how much had changed. The weight of his marriage's collapse felt heavier than ever. He started walking again, aimlessly wandering the streets, lost in thought. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why? How had it come to this? Amelia's betrayal had shattered him, but the truth was, the cracks had been forming long before Richard came into the picture. He just hadn't wanted to see them. As Thomas passed by a park, he spotted a bench and sat down, staring at the trees swaying gently in the wind. He remembered how he and Amelia used to come to this very park on weekends, lying on the grass, dreaming about the future. Those dreams seemed so naive now, like the fantasies of different people who believed in love, trust, and forever. Sitting there, Thomas forced himself to confront the truth he had been avoiding. The signs had been there all along. The late nights at the office, the excuses, the distant look in her eyes when they talked. He had seen them, but he had chosen to ignore them. He had convinced himself that their love was stronger than any temptation, that she would never betray him. But she had. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of his broken life. So he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, hesitating for a moment before turning it on. The screen lit up with a flood of missed calls and texts from Amelia. The first few were frantic, full of apologies and pleas for him to come home. But as he scrolled further, the messages grew colder, more resigned. Her last message, sent hours ago, simply read, "I'm sorry." Thomas stared at the words, feeling nothing. The anger, the pain, it had all dulled into a hollow emptiness. He knew he should feel something, but he was numb. The fight had drained him of every emotion, leaving behind only exhaustion. He didn't reply. What was the point? There were no words that could fix this. No amount of apologies could undo what had been done. Amelia had made her choice, and now he had to make his. He leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes, trying to find some sense of peace in the chaos. The world around him felt like a blur, moving forward while he was stuck in place, unable to move on. What came next? What was life supposed to look like now that everything he had built was gone? A light breeze rustled the leaves above him, and for the first time in what felt like days, Thomas took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs. He had no answers, no grand epiphany about what to do next. But as he sat there, watching the world go on without him, he realized one thing: this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Somehow, some way, he would move forward. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. The pain would fade, the anger would subside, and maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to rebuild. Not the life he had before that was gone, but something new, something different. He didn't know what that looked like yet. But for the first time since the betrayal, the idea of a future didn't seem so impossible. With a deep sigh, Thomas stood up from the bench, sliding his phone back into his pocket. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. It was time to take the first step, no matter how uncertain it felt. Thomas stood at the edge of his driveway, the house looming before him like a ghost from a life that no longer felt like his own. His footsteps were hesitant as he approached the front door, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily on his chest. The last few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, rage, sorrow, disbelief, but now, as he faced the final step in this chapter of his life, all he felt was a strange calm. The front door creaked open, and there she was. Amelia stood in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the events that had unfolded between them. So the moment their eyes met, she seemed to crumble, taking a shaky step toward him. "Thomas," her voice was barely a whisper, filled with desperation. "I didn't think you'd come back." He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at her, the woman who had once been his whole world, the woman who had destroyed that world in a single selfish act. Her tears no longer moved him, so the apologies, the excuses, they had lost their power. He was done being the man who listened to them. "I'm just here to get the rest of my things," Thomas said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. He stepped past her, his presence filling the space between them like an unspoken wall. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to say something, to give her a sign that things could still be salvaged. But that sign would never come. Amelia followed him as he made his way to the bedroom, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the house that had once been their shared home. Now it felt like nothing more than a shell, empty, lifeless, a reminder of what they had lost. "Please, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling, "we can fix this. I know I hurt you, but I love you. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please." He stopped in his tracks, his back to her, letting the weight of her words sink in. "We can fix this." The same words she had repeated over and over in her messages, in her frantic calls. The words that had once meant everything to him now felt hollow. He had heard them too many times, and now they were just noise. Turning around slowly, he looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time since that day in the office, she was still the woman he had loved for so many years, but she was no longer the woman he could trust. Trust once shattered could never be restored. It was a truth he had been trying to avoid, but now, standing here in front of her, he could no longer deny it. "There's nothing left to fix, Amelia," he said quietly. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks, but Thomas felt no urge to comfort her. He couldn't. Not anymore. Without another word, he turned away and grabbed his suitcase, the last piece of his old life. He walked back toward the door, the sound of Amelia's sobs fading behind him. As he stepped out into the fresh air, something lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was the beginning of something close to it. He had made his decision, and it was final. There was no going back. Thomas paused at the end of the driveway, looking back at the house one last time. It felt surreal. This was the place where he had imagined growing old, where he had built a life with someone he thought he knew. But now it was just another stop on a road that no longer led anywhere. With a deep breath, he turned away and started walking, not knowing where he was going, but certain he would never return.